Jerry Brownlie's interjection during Shane Jones's contribution when he said, what did we do for New Zealand investment and New Zealand ownership? Well, it's a very long list, Mr Brownlie, and I'm sad that as Minister of Economic Development you don't realise that. What did we do? Well, we set up the Cullen Fund so that at a time of surpluses, the government saved towards future retirement costs. We did that against the opposition of the National Party every election, calling for what were patently unaffordable tax cuts, which would have meant that we weren't running a surplus in a time of plenty, and New Zealand would be in the same position now as Portugal, as Spain, as Great Britain, and we wouldn't be as bad as Greece, but we would have been on the road to the Grecian problems that they've got with rising government debt, because we would not have put away money in a time of plenty. So that's the first and probably the most important thing that we did. We ran budget surpluses consistently, and we only had tax cuts when the economy was going into recession so that they were counter-cyclical. First thing we did. Second thing we did, we actually recapitalised Air New Zealand. We made sure that Air New Zealand was maintained in the ownership of New Zealand. Who opposed that? Does anyone remember? That's right, the National Party opposed that. What else did we do? We actually, with the leadership of Jim Anderton, he actually deserves more credit for this than Labor, that we supported him in doing it. We set up Kiwibank, an outstanding success. What else did we do? Someone else yelled out, Kiwirail. That's quite right, we did. We made sure that that monopoly infrastructure is in New Zealand's ownership, and that's the right thing to do. What else did we do against the criticism of National Party? We maintained Auckland Airport in New Zealand ownership when the National Party said that it should be flogged off. What else did we do? We set up Kiwisaver. And now what have the National Party done? National Party, well, first thing, if we look back a bit, well, they actually cancelled the Kirk Savings Scheme. The Kirk Savings Scheme, and I give credit to Sir Roger Douglas here, because Sir Roger Douglas has been consistent on improved savings for New Zealand for decades and was the designer of the Kirk Scheme. It was the National Party that reversed that. As Brian Gaynor recently said in the New Zealand Herald, if that scheme had been left to mature, the New Zealand capital markets would be so much deeper that we would $300 billion deeper than they currently are, and we would be probably in an even better position than the Australians are. They are plainly better off than New Zealand because of their deeper capital markets. National Party also scuppered the Peters superannuation savings plans that were again backed by ACT in the late 1990s. The National Party has undermined Kiwisaver. The National Party is not running budget surpluses. They're running excessively large government deficits because to pay for their ridiculously extensive and unaffordable tax cuts to those income tax cuts, the 35% of which goes to the top 5% of income earners, I think. 35% goes to the people who already earn the most in New Zealand. Patently not fair, and is one of the reasons why New Zealand's government deficit is so large. So against that background, what was the economic plan that we had from the government in February this year, in their February document? Still at that stage promising a step change in the New Zealand economy, but it was focusing on extensions to mining. It talked about a financial services hub possibility for New Zealand, but it didn't talk about savings, What happened in August this year? Well, their latest plan, still no talk about savings on the 1st of August this year, despite that being the standout difference between the New Zealand economy and the Australian economy. Their 1 August plan stopped talking about any step change in the New Zealand economy. They've given up on that ambition. They've stopped. They won't make any promise upon which they can be held accountable between now and 2025 for bridging the wage gap with Australia, notwithstanding the fact that it was their central election promise at the last election. We've got this 2025 date out there. The gap's growing wider. The government's been widely criticised in the media for trying to spin the numbers to pretend that it's narrowing when it is in fact widening. But still no talk on the 1st of August in respect of savings. And now we've got a committee. A committee that reports at the end of the year, Mr. Chairman, We've got a committee that is due to report at the end of the year for what is probably the most serious challenge facing New Zealand, and that is our Invisible's contribution to our current account deficit caused by New Zealanders consuming too much and not saving enough. A problem that has bedevilled New Zealand for decades and is bad now. So they set up a committee. I thought they were the government and that they were meant to lead. I thought that after 9 years in opposition they would have some idea as to what it is that they wanted to do.
No petrol, the government think tank.
After 2 years, 2 budgets, or close to 2 years and 2 budgets, they've come along to this Parliament and they've said, actually, we concede that the Labour Party is right and that we need to improve New Zealand's savings. That's essentially their message at the moment. They're not yet admitting that they were wrong to undermine Kiwisaver. They're not yet admitting that they're wrong to be running government deficits paid for by income tax cuts, 35% of which go to the top 5% of earners. They're not yet admitting that they're wrong to stop contributions to the Cullen Fund. They're not yet admitting that they've got the tax mix wrong, but they've set up a committee to give them advice on all of those issues because they do admit that New Zealand is not saving enough. So after 2 budgets, 2 years, they admit that we have a problem with, as Shane Jones says, capital accumulation. They admit that they've got a problem in New Zealand with our failure to properly save, but they don't know what they're going to do. And that is an indictment upon a government in respect of a country which has got growing unemployment, a growing wage gap between New Zealand and Australia, and broader realisation amongst New Zealand that the problem, or a major part of the problem, is our lack of savings. And it's an indictment that the government has taken 2 years to get to that position after they had 9 years in opposition. 9 years in opposition. They ought to have realised before now that the major difference between New Zealand and Australia is not mining Schedule 4 and other national parks, but is New Zealand's relative lack of savings compared with Australia. The government has squandered the last 2 years. By December this year they say they're going to have some recommendations. Well, by that time we'll be into the last year before the election. The election has to be held by November next year, and there are rumours that the government's going to hold an election before the Rugby World Cup in July or August next year. So effectively they will have wasted a whole term in office in respect of the single most important economic issue facing the country, which is our relative paucity of savings, the fact that every year we get poorer, more and more of our country is sold off overseas because we're running a current account deficit that so much now relates to invisibles, the interest and dividend flows that are flowing to overseas investors in New Zealand, and they have not taken any step in respect of savings except negative ones. And the list of the negative steps that they have taken is long. Kiwisaver, stopping the contributions to the Cullen Fund, undermining Kiwisaver, and of course these tax cuts that were too much weighted to those who are already on high incomes, 35% going to the top 5% of income earners, meaning that we've got a government deficit of many more billions of dollars every year than would have been necessary had their tax package been more responsible and more equitable. Mr. Speaker, it is lamentable that after inheriting one of the strongest government balance sheets in the world from the prior government, that this government has both squandered what they inherited and gone backwards on what is the most important difference between New Zealand and Australia, which is savings. This bill that we are currently considering ought to have provisions that strengthen Kiwisaver. It ought not to be limited to measures that ease the Trans-Tasman transferal of Kiwisaver and Australian savings, superannuation savings balances. That's a good thing to do, but it misses the bigger point that New Zealand is short of savings. The government is transparently without any adequate plan in this area. They have been exposed and have been exposed for their their inadequacy on this front once again.